White balance is a camera setting that controls the overall color balance in your shot. Now, in some situations when you're shooting at night, you may need to make some slight adjustments to the white balance. If you're shooting in RAW, which is what I would recommend, the white balance can always be adjusted after the fact in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw in Photoshop. The white balance setting as it's applied by your camera is not a permanent change to the image such as that made by aperture or shutter speed. It can always be fixed later. So even if you don't get the white balance correct when you take the picture, as long as you're shooting in RAW, you can adjust it later. Now, the good news is that in most situations, you probably can get by with the same white balance that you use for normal shooting conditions under daylight. So for instance, if you shoot using auto white balance most of the time, you probably can use that pretty well in most night situations. I shoot at auto white balance most of the time for my night photography, and it comes out pretty good. If I do need to make a slight adjustment, sometimes I'll tweak it a little bit and use a daylight white balance preset setting on the camera. Now, the irony is that if you're shooting at night under natural light conditions, so moonlight or starlight, something like that, that really is just kind of another type of daylight. Because moonlight is just reflected sunlight, and the light of the stars is the light of many distant suns. So you can get by pretty well using a daylight white balance setting for a lot of night photography situations. Where it gets kind of tricky is where you have mixed lighting. If you have a scene set up where you have, let's say, a street light and you're photographing something in the near foreground that's being illuminated by that street light could be a sodium vapor light or a halogen light, and it might be creating a really strong color cast that's making a really ugly color balance in your image if you're using the auto white balance setting or even the daylight white balance setting. So for a situation like that, you may need to tweak the white balance and use a custom white balance setting. So if you're noticing that the scene illuminated by the street light is looking really orange and yellow, what you can do is dial in a custom white balance using a specific Kelvin temperature setting. So for instance, I've often shot under streetlight illumination, and I've used a white balance of like 3600 Kelvin or even 2500 Kelvin, and that has removed that ugly yellow color cast. Now, that of course is also going to make the sky look a lot bluer, but sometimes that can look cool. Just keep in mind that white balance is always something that you can adjust later in post-processing, and sometimes you can even use the gradient tools in Lightroom or in Photoshop to apply one white balance setting to part of the image and another white balance setting to another part.